I'm going to start admitting people into the meeting.
Okay. Should I get my camera off?
You can have it on, it doesn't matter. Welcome everybody, we'll be starting the meeting shortly. We're just admitting a few more people into the meeting and we'll be beginning in just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Stovall, and I'd like to welcome you to today's town hall. I'm the Director of Programs and Events for AIA Miami, and I'd like to welcome you to the 12th in a series of town hall meetings. In addition to this event, AIA Miami and their sister organization, the Miami Center for Architecture and Design, has a lot of events coming up. Tonight, there's a book talk at 7 p.m. that's sponsored by Miami Center for Architecture Design and the FIU Wolfsonian that is really cool. It's about Chad Oppenheimer's book, Lair, The Architecture of Villainry, and it's about the super cool layers of movie villains. Go to the website, www.aiamiami.org for login details. It's a free event. We also have other events coming up in the month of July, and hold on one second, letting a few more people in. And I'd just like to let you know about them. We have a lot going on throughout the summer, but I'd like to let you know that July 3rd is the application deadline for the Christopher Kelly Leadership Program. July 6th, we kick off our Architects in the Making online summer camp for kids aged 8 through 16. And the event has been so popular that we've opened up an additional slots for 20 more children. So go on the website to find out more about the cost and to register. July 17th is MCAD's second in a series of conversations about urban redesign post-COVID, and this particular discussion centers on parks and public spaces. July 17th is also the first deadline for the AIA Miami Design Awards, so get your designs ready and get on the website to pay your fees and get ready for the Design Awards. July 23rd is a book talk with Jose Gilbert Navia on his lovely book about Cuba. There will be more events being added to our calendar every day, so please visit www.aiamiami.org to check them out. So we're going to get started in just a moment, and I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'd like you to ask you to mute yourself, keep yourselves muted, and turn off your video, which will give us more bandwidth, and it makes for a smoother presentation. And if you forget, I'm going to mute you. There's going to be a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, so please feel free to submit your questions to everyone at any time via the chat feature on Zoom. And if you don't know, it's at the bottom of the your Zoom window. And we'll read them at the end of the town hall. Again, keep yourselves muted and turn off your video. This meeting will be recorded and will be available to view on the AIA Miami website after this Friday. And now I'd like to introduce AIA Miami board member Elizabeth Camargo, Principal of EC Architecture and Design, who's today's moderator.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Before we get started, I just want to share a little information on the Christopher Kelly Leadership Development Program. This will be our third year with the program, and it's been a great success. It's very appropriate for young emerging professionals trying to brush up the leadership skills, and that can be used in their community and also in their work environments. So please don't forget, the deadline is July 3rd at 11:59 p.m. And you can visit our website for more information on the program and the application materials as well. So hope to count on you. Thank you so much again for joining the town hall. Let's get focused on resilience and adaptation. Besides having my private practice, I'm also the chair of the Resilience and Adaptation Committee. But I would like to share with you a little bit about our committee because I don't think it's very well known, and given the current situation, I'm sure there is a lot of people out there that would like to be more proactive in terms of resilience and adaptation. So we started the committee, which was originally called the Resilient Recovery Task Force, in 2017, after Hurricane Irma hit Florida and causing significant devastation. So at that point, we realized that there was a need to engage our local community of architects in disaster recovery and intensify the debate on the impact of climate change in our area. So the committee has two main goals. One is to start and maintain an ongoing disaster assistance program in our chapter, connected to the AIA Florida and the AIA National, but also very importantly, connected to the Miami-Dade Emergency Management Office, so that architects can assist with disaster relief efforts in future natural disasters. The second goal is to engage architects in the discussion about resilience and adaptation and the impact of climate change in our coastal community, looking for ways to mitigate the challenges we face and increase the adaptability of our built environment. If you'd like to participate in the committee, please get in touch with me or the AIA office. We would love to hear from you. Now let's get started with the program by introducing our honorable guests. They all have very extensive resumes, but for the sake of time, I chose just a few highlights. First, we have Jeff Huber, AIA Associate at ASLA and CARB Lead AP. He's joining us from Fort Lauderdale. He's the Principal and Director of Urban Design and Planning at Brooks Scarpa Architects, managing the firm's South Florida office. He's also an Associate Professor and Director of the School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University. Huber's work combines ecological, landscape, urban, and architectural design with a focus on resilience and adaptation. His design and research have received 75 plus national and international design awards and has been published in numerous books and periodicals. His recent project, Salty Urbanism, which provides a design framework to address future sea level rise adaptation in South Florida, received an AIA National Institute Honor Award in 2018. Next, joining us from Washington, D.C., we have Robert Finney, AIA Lead Fellow, ENVSP, and FITRO Ambassador. Robert is a climate mitigation and adaptation consultant. He has 25 years of experience leading business units specialized in sustainability and resilience, consulting with a number of mid and large-sized firms. During the current pandemic, Robert has been advising organizations on how business practices impacted by the lockdown and social distancing might perform in a new normal as we move forward and transition into a post-pandemic world. Robert is active in the AIA National as a member of the Resilience and Adaptation Advisory Group, as well as the Sustainable Leaders Group Policy Committee, which have been focusing on creating resources and guidance on how to prepare a firm to face business disruption, recovery, and the development of policies to support business during extraordinary times. And last but not least, we have our very own Jane Gilbert from Miami, but he's currently joining us from Connecticut. Jane is the first Chief Resilience Officer with the City of Miami Office of Resilience and Sustainability. She leads the city's resilience strategy development and works in partnership with the City of Miami Beach and Miami-Dade County to develop the region's first comprehensive resilience strategy plan for Greater Miami and the beaches. Additionally, as a director of the city's Office of Resilience and Sustainability, she's in charge with leading the city's response to the impacts of climate hazard. Ms. Gilbert also managed the Miami Foundation's civic leadership agenda on sea level rise, which included coordinating the unified application to 100 resilient cities and a study on how best to communicate policy and action priorities related to sea level rise. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to start by asking each one of you to tell us a little bit about your work. And Jeff, would you mind to start?
Yes, thank you for, first and foremost, for AIA Miami for inviting me to come in today. I've been, well, first I'd like to just start out, South Florida is a passion for mine. I was born and raised here. I went through a little wind event in 1992 in Homestead, Florida that many of us are probably aware of, Hurricane Andrew, that really created a lot of the challenges and opportunities I think that we see today. And it's actually something that established me into the career of architecture. I went off to University of Florida and really dove in and working with several folks there looking at resiliency and sustainability and adaptation. And this is really at its infancy where it was just starting to be talked in plans like Dan Williams' work for the wind plan in Miami, which really drew attention because that was one of the first documents that I ever saw was talking about sea level rise. And that really struck me and got me interested. And I always say I was exiled in Arkansas and came back here in 2014 to South Florida. I was exiled in Arkansas for about 10 years, but there I had an opportunity to work at a community design center. And we really grappled with a lot of these kind of obduracies within our built environment. And so my work is really trying to focus on how do we challenge ourselves, not to just think about design, but how do the policies that need to be modified work in that? And so, both through my academic, position at Florida Atlantic University School of Architecture, as well as in my professional position at Brooks Scarpa, I mean, we're really trying to grapple with these issues. But I see that the irony, and just to kind of close out here, is that it's urbanism that really gives the architectural and planning professions the kind of holistic framework for which we can engage with sustainability and resiliency issues. And so that's why my work really is foundational in this this idea of urban design and what is urban design and how does it tie both to architecture but also to planning practices.
Thank you, Jeff. Robert, would you like to be next?
Yes, and I'll echo Jeff in thanking everybody for inviting me here. So my background really had been primarily focused around sustainable solutions at broad scales, really looking at all three legs of that stool, and that really brought me in touch with this idea of socioeconomic impacts on our communities and the way that we as designers can actually influence those. That was a very natural progression to me, looking into beginning to look into adaptation and resilience issues. The way I view that, to keep it to a minimum there, is that if we can truly create resilient communities, we have in turn created truly sustainable communities as well. And that's really where the bridge happens and what I've been focusing my efforts and my career on achieving. So as Elizabeth said, most recently I've been very active in a number of AIA national committees, and that's really kind of gotten me to this point and increased that passion around it. I'm on the Resilience and Adaptation Advisory Group, which had been focusing on broad shocks and stresses and creating business continuity plans prior to this pandemic. Interestingly, that work kind of fit right into what we needed to respond to now. So it was very timely, but at the same time pointed out what we were lacking. And so our committee is desperately trying to fill in those pieces. A pandemic was low on the list of shocks and stresses that we were worried about, and clearly that's the one we should have been worried about. And just most recently, we partnered up, a few of us on this committee partnered up with the disaster recovery committee as well, and we've been working on creating guidelines for returning to the office and reopening and safe measures on that. But of course, that just leads to the next level of, well, what does it mean in a year or 2 years, 3 years when this is done? What do our efforts now really talk about what that future might look like?
Thank you, Robert. James, your turn now.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, AIA Miami, for having this panel. It's really a joy to be on this panel with Robert, Jeffrey, and yourself, Elizabeth, and to share both what the city's doing on integrating COVID response and recovery into our work, but also I'm looking forward to learning in this discussion as well. So prior to joining the city, even though I have a degree in urban community development and public administration, this is my first time in local government. Prior to the city, I had worked in large corporate environmental and social responsibility areas, as well as in the nonprofit and foundation realm around environmental and education initiatives. So it's been close to 4 years now at the city, where we've worked through both launching a couple of strategies, the urban resilience strategy in partnership with the County of Miami Beach that we're in implementation mode. And that is truly a comprehensive resilience strategy. I would say the biggest drivers of that were climate change, economic inequities, and urbanization, but certainly pandemics actually did show up in that strategy. It wasn't a top priority, but we had recently experienced Zika, and so we knew that, and luckily the community was pretty successful in addressing that pandemic, but or I wouldn't call it a pandemic, but disease that hit the community, and so we did identify it and do have some actions around it, but this certainly has made us rethink some things or tweak some actions in our strategy. We launched our climate adaptation strategy for the city, the Miami Forever Climate Ready strategy, in January of this year. We're in implementation of that, as well as the Miami Forever Bond, which is a resilience bond focused on reducing our flood risk, addressing affordable housing and parks and open space. And we're now working on an updated action plan around carbon mitigation. We will be releasing our updated greenhouse gas inventory within the next month, and starting that work. We're really going to focus that work on actions, strategies that will also fuel opportunities for local businesses and jobs for obvious reasons in this current economy. And our office has been pulled into long-term recovery planning for this novel coronavirus crisis. So if you think of the city's response in waves, there's the immediate response, which is focused on getting people tested, thinking about stay-at-home orders and other guidelines. We're now in sort of a slow reopening strategy, which is going, making sure people know what guidelines to focus as they open. In the long-term recovery, we're thinking about that long-term assistance to businesses and individuals to get back to work, think about new economic opportunities that we can help foster. How do we do better to help our businesses in the city in terms of just making it easier to set up or expand, et cetera, in the city. So that our office is thinking about policies, partnerships, and data tracking that we need to have to be able to monitor the long-term recovery. This is a long-term crisis that we're in, so we'll be monitoring the impacts over several years.
Thank you, Jane. So I would like to address my first question to Robert. Could you tell us how is this pandemic different from the other shocks that we faced during climate change and disruption?
Well, it's kind of a trick question in some ways. The reality is that of all the other shocks and stresses, we've not really had to face something of this scale and magnitude. So really the primary difference, and it's a big difference, is that the size and the amount of time that this is hitting us. But if you really think about it, it's a business disruption, it's a societal disruption, very much akin at a smaller scale to the other shocks that we often face. So you being in Miami, if you think about a massive hurricane that comes in, causes damage, puts businesses out of business for a while, puts people out of work for a while, takes away power. There's a finality to it because recovery can happen at a quicker level, right? But at the same time, the lessons that we're learning here can directly apply to business continuity, societal continuity that we might face in what might be a lesser sort of shock and stress. And lesser from a long-term scale, obviously they're all bad. But the difference really is how can we do this for a long period of time as opposed to a short period of time. Again, the solutions can very much be the same.
Thank you. Jeff or Jane, would you like anything would like to add anything to Robert's comments?
Just briefly, Robert hit it right on in terms of the global nature also being something that's hitting, everyone in the country, everyone globally, which has been interesting for me because every CRO across the globe is also facing this. So we've been able to exchange a lot of resources. In terms of disaster response, we had to learn how to move, usually in formal FEMA structures, they encourage everyone to get together in one emergency operations center and work together so they can exchange ideas and solutions very quickly and respond quickly. We had to move that to a remote emergency operations center. And that's a good lesson for us into the future as well, to be more nimble in that way. And I think Robert hit it, the uncertainty of the time, that this is, how long are we going to be responding to this particular pandemic is a little different than some of the other ones. Maybe similar to the mortgage crisis in 2008, but different than a hurricane in that sense.
Well, it's definitely a shock and a stressor. It's not the black swan that most people are even talking about this event. And I always like Nassim Taleb's books, but the pandemic just kind of, I think it's a fast shock, and I think we need to differentiate fast from slow shocks in some cases. And so the question kind of infers to how does it relate to climate change and those types of disruptions. And so when we see, especially in South Florida, sea level rise, I mean, that's a slow and steady rise. And you always hear the analogy or the metaphor of the frogs in the boiling water. You stick them in there in a water that's not boiling and you turn it on high, eventually they won't even jump out, because they'll just boil. And this is a bit more different just because it's a fast shock. And so I want to just make sure that we kind of can differentiate, and hopefully we all do, the idea of the fast versus the slow, and not to take our eyes off of these longer term issues that are going to still be essential to solve in our built environment moving forward. And so, I agree with everything Jane and Robert have said. I just, that's how I would kind of also think about this, is that it's all interrelated. And to go back to Talib's books, I mean, Anti-Fragile talks about this, the fact that we live in a very fragile built environment, that if it can't even kind of handle some of these just basic shocks. And let's be honest, we've had viruses and pandemics, over the history of humankind. How this one's different, and I like how Jane's it somewhat responded to it, is the fact that we now have technology, we have information on hand, we have smart cities, we have these other capacities that allow us to track things, that allow us to do things and react in a much faster, broader, and more systemic approach. And that's going to be critical moving forward. And that's what I think this pandemic, or this latest one, is going to at least achieve. If you saw the ones from the 1850s, or even the Spanish flu, it was more about sanitation, sanitary, sewers, all those kind of aspects that came about. But this one is really going to be about how does digitizing and information get delivered and transferred and exchanged. Not only is it going to be a spatial fix, I think, to our built environment.
If I could just quickly add, and not to take away any of the power that Jeff just gave in his response there, appreciate that. I did want to point out that there is a silver lining, perhaps, to all of this, not just the lessons that we learned, but in the sense of the time that we have. We know that this is going to be ongoing. We don't need to come up with a quick Band-Aid to fix these things, as so often happen with so many of these other shocks. They come and go quickly, and then we forget about them very quickly. We're not going to forget about this. We have the time to actually put into good long-term planning in this response, and then ultimately to link it to other shocks and stresses that we might be facing, cohabitate that solution space. But we have the time to do it, so let's do it right.
Yeah, so one thing to keep, I think, the eye on is how these quick Band-Aids that we may be applying now due to trying to keep people safe as they go back to work, what will be the impact of those quick Band-Aids in our long-term policies towards resiliency and adaptation. If you want to add anything to that, or I should jump into my next question.
There's a lot to talk about on this.
All right.
If you want to make the question.
Okay, so let me ask, so I'll jump into the next question. What trends might our current situation bring to the way we design buildings to live, work, and play in the future? Robert?
Sorry. Well, I guess I'll take a step back to the point that you made there. I just want to make sure that people are being careful about making a Band-Aid solution as their long-term strategy. There are certain aspects of how we have to address our social distancing and cleaning and all of those that can come across as Band-Aids, but if we treat them as temporary solution rather than Band-Aids and understand that they're temporary solutions, we can actually plan a little more effectively. So for example, I know a lot of offices are putting up or will be putting up separation screens, sneeze guards as it may be, between workstations. Don't make those permanent part of your strategy. Make them so you can unbolt them and stick them in a storage closet for the next pandemic or disaster that might happen. And there are a number of administrative solutions that are very effective, or movement of furniture is very effective, that are temporary solutions that can be undone and go back to normal in that sense. But if we treat them like a Band-Aid, then we risk trying to live with those in the future as well, and not really long-term permanent solutions. I think ultimately, though, it's less about the physical space and modifications that we do to our architecture to solve for this. I think that is definitely part of it, but I think there's a lot of operational administrative functions that need to alter as well. It's taking a look at what the work from home actually means for us, and realizing that, yes, all these polls are out there saying that workers, really a large section of the staff out there do not want to work from home. The reality is that when they talk about a majority, they're actually lumping in the people who don't want to work at home as well as the people who want to work 1 or 2 days at home. So if you look at all those poll numbers, the people who want to do some work at home is actually a large majority. And we have to plan around that. That's not simply saying I'm not coming into work today. There are operational administrative changes that need to be effective to make that an effective solution, for example. I think the long term is that we're going to start seeing our workplaces more as hubs for collaboration, which we have to do on purpose. We are a social society, but we also have production time that doesn't need that kind of social atmosphere. So I think it's going to be a balance of working from home and a balance of working in a hub-like center for collaboration and centralization of that staffing. But if anything impacts how we design our spaces in the future, it's that idea that we create hubs now. And what I'd like to point out is a hub is exactly what we need for any sort of resilience event. A centralization of resources, a centralization of information, and human contact, and we can be effective in treating this as a hub. We can be effective as creating hubs down the road to help our communities.
Thank you. Anybody want to pitch in, or should I repeat my question? Sorry, Robert, I misunderstood your comment. I thought we should save that for later. Jane,
yeah.
you look like you want to say something. Go ahead.
I just was going to add to, I liked Robert's comment about really thinking about changing of operations, because it's been something that the city's really been doing a lot of in terms of, we'd already started to move to online permitting and online providing more services to residents and businesses through a digital format, but we really accelerated that so that people can set up a business, get permits, etc., in an online, and are actually finding that we're processing those more efficiently as well. So that makes us rethink design of our new administration building, because we won't have to have as much face time with our residents and businesses. We find that our residents and businesses don't necessarily want to do that. So they're just as happy to submit things online. But I really like Robert's comment about the idea of office space as hubs. I think that certainly all the city leadership, as well as many departments, are supportive of working remotely while it's safe to do so. I think they're supportive of moving to more flexibility going forward once this passes, and really do want to reemphasize the idea of hubs, resilience hubs at a neighborhood level for community response. Whether that's a physical hub, or now, which we've been planning for as a city, to thinking also about the communication networks that allow neighborhood level hubs to function without having to gather in a specific area. So it's enabled us to think deeper about that combination of a physical hub and communication networks.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with the comments that have been made. I mean, the good thing is from a professional side, Brooks Scarpa, we've been a bi-coastal practice. We're headquartered out in Los Angeles, and then we have our office here in South Florida too, in Fort Lauderdale. And so, interestingly enough, we already had this kind of flexibility built in, and we had this kind of telecommuting. So it was very easy for us to kind of adapt right to the pandemic from that standpoint, because we've already kind of integrated that seamless office. But I mean, to talk about, Robert's comment, I think, we will see the office more as a hub in the future. We are lending more flexibility to our staff now, and we will in the future to potentially work from home if that's an option. But I think, to kind of come back to the initial question, which was live, work, and play, I think we're all finding that even in our own homes, if we're coming down to a building, our homes have now been where we live, work, and play, at 24/7. And it's interesting, is like, how do you separate, we were all talking about these life-work balances, or work-life balance, and how do you separate this now? I mean, it's great. I don't have a commute, but I'm finding that I have one Zoom meeting from another, and I don't even have a bio break in between them, right? So we become very hyper efficient, I think, and productive during this pandemic. but the long-term impacts could be detrimental to our health, ironically, and not even from the pandemic, just mental health, our physical health. And I know we'll probably talk on some of these topics later down through some of these questions, but I think if we get down to the building, what is shocking to me, and it's been shocking, and I mean, not to go back to Hurricane Andrew, but you only have to go back to even Hurricane Irma, where a lot of us just didn't have power for a certain period of time, or just living in our houses. I can't even go back, let's just say, to the FAU School of Architecture right now. The building we have in downtown Fort Lauderdale, I mean, it's criminal. Not to, somebody might get mad at me for saying that, but we have no operable windows. I mean, how can you have a building with no operable windows? To me is criminal, especially if you need to have natural ventilation. You need to have, I mean, how do we live in this environment, especially in South Florida, where it's a hot, humid climate? I understand that there's some mechanization that needs to happen there, but I think just as we changed the codes and modified those to make our buildings more resilient from hurricanes, we're making them more resilient from flooding, but I think we should also make them climate resilient in the sense that we have options. And we talk about affordability right now. I mean, the fact that we're building homes that folks can't even open a window because it's not the proper orientation. It's not the proper, size of a window, to really allow for breezes to be harvested through that. But these are all things that we're going to really have to come to grasp with. And I think it's going to be widespread for building codes, especially looking at more passive design strategies from a standpoint of how we bring light and air. I mean, ironically, these are the things we were talking about in past pandemics, and they still have not been inculcated in a code for us because we live in an environment where we rely on energy is cheap, and that mechanical augmentation is better than anything. And so I honestly feel this will, and I would say I hope this would change those attitudes as well. And so there's going to be, I think, some challenges to building codes moving forward just from this, that we don't have the options. I can't bring my students back to that school for longer than an hour period of time because we recirculate air. We don't have the ability to open it up to having, again, operable windows. So, I think those are going to be the challenges to answer this question. I mean, it's multifaceted, but, even the way that we design our residences are going to, I think, drastically change because, again, we do live, play, sleep, eat, everything in them. And so, those are going to be radical changes, I think, to how we design buildings in the future, not just cities, but the buildings we live in.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I think we would need maybe a series of town halls to exhaust all the potential subjects that can as the outcome of this conversation. But I'd like to move our conversation a little bit to the urban scale. And Jane has briefly mentioned her connection with the International Chief Resiliency Officers. So I would like you to tell us a little bit about what's happening at the national and the global level in terms of the building lessons learned from COVID-19 and as they apply to the urban resilience movement.
Yeah, thanks. So probably many people on this call are aware of the 100 Resilient Cities program that was funded by Rockefeller. That transitioned into a new nonprofit called the Global Resilient Cities Network that's really truly led and driven by the CROs throughout the world. And they created, in response to this pandemic, a Cities for Resilient Recovery, which is hopefully someone can post this in the chat or after the a link, but professionals from anywhere can join the newsletter and attend some of the webinars, as well as any city, to share practices and learn from other cities about what they're doing. I think this can reinforce the importance in the city realm of our pedestrian realm, the need for open space and parks and safe, walkable, shaded areas in South Florida. But the other side of the concern is that we saw the most dense urban contexts be at the most risk for transmission. And so the fear is that this will result in a de-urbanization a little bit. But one of the things that I attended one of these Resilient City webinars and learned from Paris and some other European cities focusing on what they're calling the 15-minute city, where you have hubs, to use Robert's term, but hubs of areas where you can access by foot or bicycle within 15 minutes, basically all your needs to shop, do business, work, play, etc. And it may be that rethinking the city landscape is not to completely to suburbanize, but to think scale in a different way so that we have accessible open space business areas that are accessible by foot or micro mobile tools, whether they're bicycles or scooters or whatever they are. So those are just some of the things that the CROs are thinking about. Certainly there's a lot more on economic recovery, but in terms of design, that's one of the areas that they're thinking about.
Thank you. So we know that historically, past pandemics have changed the design of our cities. And how do you feel that the novel COVID-19 coronavirus will change the way we design cities from now on? Jeff, would you like to give a shot?
Yeah, and I can actually jump on what Jane was just talking about in some ways. I mean, what the mayor in Paris is doing with the 15-minute city, I think is phenomenal. And I think the stress that you're seeing, or at least the movement, is more towards that local will become critically important again. And Jane's pointing to it too, that our built environment, our public realm, which is primarily streets, will need to be readapted. Maybe there's to ensure, and Robert's already touched on this, but to ensure on proper physical distancing, we're going to need to be able to expand. And Jane said it best, that they need to be safe, walkable, and shaded, too. We live in a hot, humid climate. So, how do we rethink and readjust the cities and specifically the public realm from the novel coronavirus is going to be a tremendous feat. And, and I think, ironically, this is where I see it aligning with climate change. That climate change, we're asking for more room for water. We're asking for these things that we can reinvent our public realm. I think we all see now that the prioritization around cities and the automobile is not the future that we all want. I think it's encouraging that I go and walk out in my neighborhood now, and I see a lot of my neighbors doing that. We're all walking down the street. We just want more shade trees, as Jane is mentioning. I think we now realize, and we have a critique a bit more of our built environments around us from that standpoint. But this is it is gonna vastly change, just like it's changed in the past pandemics. When you saw Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted's Central Park proposal was a direct reaction to a lot of the issues, especially around sanitation, but some other previous pandemics, as well as viruses and bacteria that were in the built environment, as ways to create health. Because again, I think just like we have healthcare systems in our cities around medical, our built environment is our best healthcare system. If we don't get that right, we're going to still have these issues.
Thank you, Jeff. Robert, would you like to add something else?
Yes, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll try to keep it short here. I just kind of want to grow on what Jeff and Jane were talking about, this 15-minute city. I think there's a larger idea at play here that we can really learn from. It's not just about being able to get on a bike and go shopping or go to a restaurant or visit your friends. It's about creating microgrids where your energy within a certain range. And we're talking about concentric circles of different services. Right now, when I want strawberries at the grocery store, they come from California. At the same time, when I want sweet corn, I have to wait until they're in season because it comes from Maryland Shore right nearby. That's how we have always lived our societies. We rely on that local supply chain, not only to support local businesses, but because it's more resilient. far more resilient than having to rely on long-term or long-distance supply chains. It's more sustainable because there's less energy and less all the issues around that. So I think that we can, as we start to redesign our cities and our communities that surround those cities, we can start looking at what those rings really represent and how do we start creating a passively survivable set of buildings, a passively survivable community based on the infrastructure that we know we can put into place.
Thank you. So one thing that worries me a little bit is that some of the pandemic responses we are implementing now may have a negative impact on the ongoing climate change mitigations and the sea level rise adaptation efforts that were in place up to now. So I would like to hear your take if you think will be more negative, more positive, a little bit of each, the silver lining, where is it? Who'd like to go first?
I mean, I can take it on first. I mean, this kind of touches, one onto some of Jane's comments. First and foremost, I think de-densification would be a wrong way of taking this. And I think to Jane's point, we should probably avoid the re-suburbanization of our built environment. Because there, as Robert's point is there's a lot more we can gain from being concentrated or at least intensified around each other. And I would say, I don't like the word density. I mean, I try to avoid the word the D word in any of my conversations. I usually talk about the intensity, the fact that you have basic services around you. Some of those things are going to become, critically important. I mean, just to touch on this, in Robert, not to try to, not to add into the past question, but, Robert's talking about food. I think, how we see our localized food network it's going to become, I think, a lot more in these hubs, these 15-minute kind of, you don't have to look back far, but to 1929 when Clarence Perry had his neighborhood unit. We've been talking about these things. The 15-minute city is not a new phenomenon, although I think what they're talking about is the connection of being able to walk, bike, or use mass transit within a 15-minute access. But this really does create kind of clusters, neighborhood clusters, where we know each other and therefore we feel somewhat safer. We know the markets we're going to. We know where the food that we're purchasing comes from, as Robert's even talked about the microgrid. And so there's these kind of attitudes. I just want to make sure that that we do understand how we're going to adapt to them. But, to go back to your original question, Elizabeth, about how is this going to negatively potentially impact climate change and sea level rise, things that we were doing, I think it's important to always consider and keep in mind the co-benefits of whatever we're proposing as solutions. So it can't be this or that. And I know we're all reading these reports that it's unfortunate, especially with the loss of sales tax revenue across the state at city levels. Even within our higher education, we're seeing that. I mean, I'm seeing it, with hospitality, a lot of loss of that market, and architecture. We have to make ourselves a bit more resilient and understanding how this is an ecosystem, how we relate the economy, the social aspects, as well as the ecological aspects of anything that we do need to be considered. So I think it's a misstep to lose funding for some of these other things, because the exact thing that Jane and the whole first point of this that I was going to make about de-densification, I mean, you don't have to look much further than to know that a 3-story city creates enough tax base to actually support the basic services around it. That is the fire, the police, the water, the sewer, the roads. All that infrastructure has to get paid for. And the only way to do that is by living in close proximity to one another, that we can benefit, again, from a tax base that can support that. And the alternatives just aren't there. And so I'll leave it at that and let other folks answer.
Robert?
Just quickly, I want to kind of go to the micro level here. The concerns that I've been seeing in discussing folks moving back into the office and their set of solutions is that many of them are true Band-Aids in the sense that they're very energy intensive in their solutions. And rather than looking at what Jeff had already touched on this idea of a passive system within our buildings, operable windows, lots of daylighting, cross ventilation in a purposeful sort of way. They're talking about increasing the amount of systems used so we can provide 100% outside air. That's a Band-Aid solution, and all it's doing is exasperating energy use on that, frankly. That's just one example, but I would just caution as you go through what strategies you're looking at is start thinking about what that environmental impact might be. Disposable masks and PPE. Are we providing boxes of disposable gloves and masks to all of our visitors? Or are we encouraging them to have their own that are reusable? I mean, we're creating waste problems that we have yet to really start even talking about at this point. So I think if we're mindful of what that impact might be, we can make smarter decisions now. And again, I go back to the point that we have time to figure this out. Let's not just jump on the first thing that comes along.
Thank you. Jane, would you like to give it?
Just real quick on another micro level, this crisis has slowed down our efforts around investing in adaptive infrastructure and new plans slightly because it's diverted attention. But luckily, our Miami Forever bond is secured funding and it's there. Hopefully, there will be a stimulus package that will help us with some further stormwater infrastructure funding. All of that will help with the economic recovery, right? To create local business and job opportunities here through our adaptation efforts. I think the way that we think about this is really forcing that. We're looking at those co-benefits as much as possible as we design. So in our update to our carbon mitigation plan, we've emphasized the need to create initiatives that will really drive local job and business opportunities. I think that's the only way to really move this forward, is that we have to think in an integrated way about how to recover from this crisis, how to learn from this, and integrate it into those either carbon mitigation or climate adaptation efforts.
Thank you. So we have one question from a participant. Barbara is asking us, what are some architectural strategies we can start implementing right now as we think for solutions for the future? And that ties a little bit in a question that I have mainly for the two architects in the panel. How do you see your practice, your architectural practice changing, not only in terms of the physical space, we have brushed on that, but also in how you approach the design of a new building and how do you engage in your business practice per se? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that first.
All right.
First and foremost, I would just say, how do we start implementing these strategies now is just kind of going back to how we used to design predating air conditioning. And I know Robert just mentioned, I mean, some of these things will be challenging within our built environment. But I usually, in the office, we always kind of have this funny question that we ask our clients or that we even kind of say during presentations, like, how many of you would raise your hand, or how many of you do not like fresh air or daylight? Those are just kind of really odd questions. And we know that, first of all, there's only so many, if you create a glass wall, only 40% of the wall surface needs to be glazing. Because anything over that, you're not getting any more daylight into the building. I mean, that's just a kind of known fact based on, glazing to wall ratios. And so there's strategies for which we should just be designing. As a good architect, any architect that was trained well knows how to first and foremost design for their context, their climate, the environments they're in. But I think what I would want to see happen, because what we're also, so that's a design side. We also are trying to change policy. I mean, some of this is really going to have to get through the legalities of code, that were mired by zoning ordinances that were mired by, which really the zoning ordinances are steeped in suburban planning techniques. We have not modified those. Parking, having first of all, parking minimums is you know, a problem in itself, not for today's town hall, but you know, these issues will come to the forefront, and if there is just areas of a city where municipalities or even county governments were willing to allow innovation districts that allowed us to test and modify, or test and try to find ways to prototype new solutions, you know, almost a kind of an area that has a little more flexibility, I think would be an important thing that would come out of this, that we can, you know, kind of, that's always the biggest challenge, is the pilot projects, and then going ahead and mainstreaming those things, because nobody wants to be the guinea pig. Nobody wants to be the first one to do a lot of the great ideas that I've been saying. And I mean, we could sit here all day and talk about the research that's being done and the modeling that's being done, but nobody seems to want to take those steps, you know, to be the ones to implement those first. And if we just had areas in a city where we can test and kind of use that, I think would be a profound change and a game changer for us as a community to be able to look at alternative responses for trial and error.
And I think a lot of what you're talking about, Jeff, is stuff that we took for granted 150 years ago already. So it's not that we need to find guinea pigs for this. We just need to go back and look at the practical, pragmatic history of our urban environment. And there were problems back then, don't get me wrong, but I think paired with what we've learned since can be a really an effective way to do it. To add to that, in answer to the question, I think one of the most important things that we can do as architects, one of our largest responsibilities, is to sit down with our clients and ask the hard questions that we really haven't tried to ask before. Being mindful, well, this is our benefactor and we're not going to offend them. We're not going to go in and create structural changes around the way they do business. We're going to listen to them and design exactly what they want. There is argument to that, but at the same time, because these are different and there are changes that need to be required, we need to expand how we approach this. I think one of the biggest hurdles that I have had in talking with clients, people I'm consulting with, is this idea that, but that's not within our culture. We can't do that because it's against our culture. So we're not going to go remote because it's against our culture. The reality is that culture, by definition, is evolutionary. It is the what a company stands for, how, you know, what it operates under, what motivates it. It's not the how you do it. So if you want a collaborative culture, that's great. That's a great cultural aspect. But there are 1,000 ways to be collaborative. Don't be blindsided by the one way that you've determined 2 years ago, because nothing's going to be the same. We talk about this new normal. We have no idea what that new normal is going to be. But there will be a normal, and it won't be what we think it is today. And if we don't adapt over time to what that normal is going to be, the folks that live in the past are going to die in the past as well. So just be very cautious and start guiding your clients to really think about that long-term impact, and that change could be necessary, and it's not a bad thing. Change is hard, but not a bad thing.
Thank you. Well, we have only 2 minutes left of our time. So as we are closing, I would like to ask for each one of you if you have any parting words of advice for our participants. I'd like to start with Jane.
Oh, that's a tall order. You know, I think designers are creative solution makers, and I think by nature are able to integrate multiple constraints and opportunities into a solution. And so I think this is just another layer of that you are adding into your business, and it allows us to stretch and think new in a new way, So I encourage you all to do that. This has been really informative, Robert and Jeff. I always learn from you. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Jeffrey?
Yeah, no, and likewise, Jane, always learn from you. And so I appreciate being able to be on here, and it's great to meet you, Robert, too, by the way. But, you know, I think to piggyback a little bit on Robert's comments that he was just going on, I mean, we need to understand that architects are thought leaders. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as the demand side, which I think is what Robert was saying. It's like the ambulance chase. We just kind of chase the project and do what the client wants, but the client doesn't know what the client doesn't know. We are the thought leaders from that. We know, and we should, because we're the last of the generalist professions. We're last of those kind of Renaissance professions where we should know a little bit about everything. And in some cases, we have deep knowledge in certain things, and that's where we should just understand where our specialties lie, but we really do engage. And so we need to be the supply leaders. We need to be the supply side thinkers and offering up the solutions and, you know, knowing how to navigate through those processes. I mean, as a designer, it's not enough. We need to also be policymakers. We need to be policy writers. We need to know how things actually get done as architects, because otherwise we cannot change that. And this is not, should not be enlightening. These are the things that we as a profession have done for centuries. It's just in the last 50 years, we've given up a lot of these aspects, but it's now our time, because these are wicked problems, and these are design problems. And so they're going to require design thinking. And with that, I think we all need to be the supply side providers in there. So, again, Elizabeth, I thank you today, and I thank you for this opportunity.
You're welcome. Yeah, so I just want to add one little thing to what you just said, Jeff, is that, yes, we as the architects, we're the providers, but I think one role that we often forget is that our work with our governmental leaders in terms of adjusting building codes and zoning codes, which that's a very important step into making all our ideas become a reality and legal realities. So we need also to participate in those bodies and share our ideas to make sure they make into policy, as you mentioned, and rules and regulations, so we can all be on the same page. So to end our town hall, Robert, would you like to share with us your last comments?
Sure. I love that last point you made, Elizabeth. I mean, I think that we are are in a unique position to really make an impact on the built environment through that policy side. We tend to have a maybe overblown reputation of being experts, and in a very sophisticated set of professions here. But that also gives us a benefit of ears. I love this idea of us being on the supply side. I think there's a whole narrative we can produce around that. Ultimately, I just want to reiterate the fact that we have the time to do this right. And then if we think through the impacts of every decision that we make and open our mind up to something different and really exploring those, then we have a real chance to have a lasting impact, not just for this pandemic, not just for strengthening communities, but for creating a truly resilient set of communities, which makes them sustainable, as I said at the beginning. I think that, well, I'll just leave it at that. There's so much more we can talk about. We need a couple hours on this. Thank you so much for having us, Jeff. It was great to meet you. Jane, as always, just reminded me it's been way too long since we spoke, and we should catch up. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you for being with us today and sharing your wealth of experience and knowledge. Hopefully we'll have a chance to do another one of those. And I think Colleen has some closing comments too.
No, I just wanted to thank you so much for holding a wonderful webinar. It was just amazing, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for spending the time. And next week, same day on Wednesdays at 12 o'clock will be our next town hall. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.